Hello, welcome to Queering Arthur, a podcast where you can join us in exploring queer interpretations of Arthurian legend. I'm Dr. Schuyler Rad.
And I'm Kelly Oakler.
Today, we're talking about The Ruin of Britain by Gildas from 548 CE. This podcast is for mature audiences. This episode contains academic descriptions of sexual relations, a thread of sexual violence found in ancient poetry, discrimination against sex workers found in the source text, causes of rape culture found in our analysis, and misogynistic language as used in its historical context.
If any of that sounds like something you don't want to listen to, then please take care of yourself and skip this episode. Alright, so we read The Ruin of Britain in this collection by Richard White, and I don't have a whole lot of context for this. This is not my particular expertise in history, so I know you've been reading a lot about this and been really deep diving, so why don't you tell us some about how this all fits in and who wrote this and why and just everything. Give it to us, just all of it.
All of it, here it comes. So we'll focus in with our hermeneutic satellite, taking first this wide depth of field to get the high-level cultural view. So Gildas wrote this traditionally around 548 CE. So 6th century Britain. 'Tis a silly place. Mm-hmm. It's a time of significant cultural transition. The Romans had just left in 410 CE, so that was the 5th century, and they had been there for almost 4 centuries. I don't want to talk about the Roman Empire a lot. It is on my mind. But Britain was a part of the Roman Empire from the mid-1st century to the beginning of the 5th century.
So we're only tangentially talking about the Roman Empire and thinking about the Roman Empire.
Yes. So the Romans left the island of Great Britain in the year 410 CE, which left a power vacuum in this once vast area of Roman land was now fragmented and regionalized. One of the leaders who tried to fill this power vacuum was Vortigern, and tradition dictates Vortigern invited German mercenaries, Horsa and Hengist, to fight for him against other British leaders. Horsa is actually from a German word for horse, and Hengist is from a German word for stallion. So there's some history saying that maybe they're the same person or multiple stories kind of came across, and now we talk about them as 2 separate people, but they might have been the same person.
So 1 or 2 horsemen.
1 or 2 horsemen. These mercenaries, they came from Germany. They were from the German group, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. But after they fought for Vortigern, they turned on him.
Plot twist.
The treachery of the long knives. This is what eventually led to the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. Let's engage our satellites, useful historical constructs mode. The heptarchy wasn't a real thing. It's just an idea that someone created to better understand this period of history. Although there were many regional kings and leaders, it's these big players: East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, Sussex, and Wessex.
So the Romans have left, so who was there to begin with? Was it just the Celts, right?
Yeah, the Celtic people. Once the heptarchy was going after the Romans left and up to Gildas's time in the mid-6th century, on the island of Great Britain, the Celts occupied that area that was the western and northern regions, modern-day Wales and Scotland. So the Romans left the island of Great Britain in the year 410 CE. They had been there for centuries.
So they were there for 4 centuries? That's like twice as long as the U.S. has been around. That must have left quite a big influence on the area, right?
Yeah, there was a big influence that the Romans left in Great Britain.
Were there influences in the language, like with Spanish and French being Latin-based languages?
Yeah, modern Welsh, about 15% of the vocabulary has Latin origins, especially those words that were really important to the Romans, like military, economic, and religious words. For example, castell is the Welsh word for castle, and in Spanish it's castillo. The Welsh word for gold is aur, and in Spanish it's oro. The Welsh word for church is eglwys. In Spanish it's iglesia.
So they had a word for church, but were they Christian at that point?
Yeah, Christianity had been the official state religion of the Roman Empire for almost 100 years before the Romans left. Celtic Christian monasticism had been growing by the time Gildas wrote The Ruin of Britain.
So what is monasticism?
Monasticism, it's a set of rules and ideas about how monks and nuns should live their lives.
Does it matter that it's Celtic monasticism versus, I don't know, another form?
The Celts had been developing a certain form of Christianity that came head to head with Christianity that had been developing in southern Europe coming out of Rome. Pope Gregory in 597 sent Augustine. Now that's Augustine of Canterbury, not Augustine of Hippo. There's lots of Augustines. It's a really confusing thing.
Oh, good.
Augustine was there to convert a king, the King of Kent, from Anglo-Saxon paganism to Christianity. And this was all about the king, King Ethelbert. This was all about King Ethelbert trying to get married. He was so hot for this Frankish princess, Bertha, that he was going to give up his religion and convert to Christianity.
Damn. She must have been real hot.
I've seen the pictures.
Were they saucy?
They were paintings, not pictures. I lied.
Dang.
So Kent, where King Ethelbert was, being in the very southeast of the Heptarchy, which is where Augustine landed, from there, that form of Christianity kept moving to the northwest, and more was running into this centuries-old version of Christianity that had already existed on the island of Great Britain, which caused some problems.
So they had two different versions of Christianity, very much like we have several denominations today. I grew up going to a Presbyterian church, and so when I would meet someone who went to a different denomination, it was always interesting to hear what they accepted and what their traditions were, even though, like, supposedly this is all the same religion, right? Learning when I was older that some churches used wine for communion was pretty wild to me because we always used grape juice, and we were, or at least my family was fairly strict about not taking communion until you had done your confirmation in the church.
So you were raised Presbyterian. Did they pass around a collection plate?
Yeah.
Well, at my church, they made a big deal about them not passing around a collection plate. They had a little box in the back with a little hole in it, and you could stuff your money in the hole, which was kind of pleasurable in a way, to stick your finger in the hole. But the denominations today disagree about different things than what the Romans and the Celts were disagreeing about. Kelly, they were arguing about haircuts and what date to plan their Easter party. Sounds pretty queer to me. They may seem insignificant to us, but they did really matter to the people of the time. Or maybe it was just a power dynamic. In addition to this haircuts and Easter party disagreements, there was also this big daddy of British heretics was Pelagius. Pelagianism, in short, was a disagreement about the very nature of humanity.
That sounds exhausting.
Yes, very exhausting, especially since they were talking about original sin, like, no, I was born bad, no, you were born bad, no, I was born good. And
then they decided it was the women.
Yes, But it was all in Latin.
The women, parentheses, in Latin.
This is a lot to take in. We're just getting this high-level cultural view from our hermeneutic satellite aboard our fully automatic luxury queer space station. But for more about the Anglo-Saxon and Christian history of this time, a really low barrier to entry would be the British History Podcast. Specifically, episode 116 from February 27th, 2014. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie after the Romans left. All of this breaking up and regionalization or fractionalization that was happening after the Romans left, it led to the people being more reliant on local resources and production to meet their needs, which led to the rise of manorialism.
Like manorialism, like a manor, like an estate?
Right. Manorialism was a system where a local lord held land and exercised authority over the peasants who worked the land. This form of government, which formed after the Romans left and had this power vacuum and all the local lords were fighting, made it really easy for the Anglo-Saxons to come in and start conquering and forming the Heptarchy. But that was in the southeast of Great Britain. In the northwest, they saw what was going on, and so the local lords didn't want to have their single estate conquered, so they worked with other local lords to start pooling their resources, and they had to appoint someone to take care of all of those pooled resources, like a king.
King of the who?
King of the Britons!
So the peasants wouldn't have known or maybe even cared about a king, right?
Right. I didn't vote for you.
Help, I'm being repressed.
So this story of local lords coming together and pooling their resources and appointing a leader in common repeated itself throughout northwest Great Britain, leading to this motif that Leslie Alcock calls the Arthur-type figure. Although there may have been no single King Arthur, the mythos of the Arthur-type figure from this time became deeply embedded in the cultural fabric, reflecting societal values and aspirations. From our hermeneutic satellite, let's zoom in now on the author, Gildas. Gildas was a 6th century British monk and historian.
Parentheses, in Latin.
Yes, Latin was the scholarly and ecclesiastical language of the educated elite in medieval Europe.
So, where did he live? Like, in what area?
His precise monastic community is uncertain. He was a learned and devout Christian monk, though. So,
he wrote what we read, which was The Ruin of Britain. So, like, why the Ruin of Britain? What ruined it for him?
As a Christian monk, he was concerned, aka super judgy, about the moral decay and political instability in post-Roman Britain.
So, from his perspective, it was ruined.
Right, his perspective. That's the hermeneutic that we're using, where our perspective runs up to the perspective of the author. That perspective idea in hermeneutics is called the horizon, and where we meet together, that's the fusion of horizons. Yes, Gildas wrote his work, The Ruin of Britain, from his perspective, and it is quite a perspective. often considered polemical, meaning coming from one side. Polemical, sharing a root word with polarizing. Also, Gildas was not really a very good historian by today's standards. There's almost no names or dates in the Ruin of Britain.
I wouldn't have gotten him very far in college. Sorry, I just thought of that, and I was like, I'm going to do it.
I like it. Yeah. That's the end of it. Nice. I don't know if I should say something. What could I say? I don't know. I like it.
I could probably just...
yeah, it's good. Let's zoom in on that text using our hermeneutic satellite. As a Christian monk, in this polemical text, Gildas passionately critiques the moral decay of Britain's rulers. I use that word passionate because that is his perspective. That's the fusion of horizons. We can all relate to the idea of having passion or a passionate approach to things, and that's what I want to ascribe to Gildas, is that it was a passionate critique of the moral decay of Britain's rulers.
He had big feelings.
As big as the house?
So big.
As big as the neighborhood?
The biggest of feelings.
As big as Britain? In Gildas's passionate critique, he mostly refrains from offering specific names, dates, or detailed historical accounts, but one person whom he does specifically refer to is Malgan Gwynedd, or Malgo Cunis in Latin, or just Malgo.
Malgo to his friends.
Yes, his nickname.
So, what's up with Malgo? What's he got to do with this?
I want to mention this section specifically from the Ruin of Britain because it intersects with some queer themes. Sometimes much ado is made over how Gildas describes Malgo. He writes, Malgo Cune, wet with wine pressed from the vine of Sodom.
Sodom, like, is he meaning like Sodom and Gomorrah, like sodomite?
Well, exactly, that's my point. A lot of people think it does refer to being a sodomite. They see that word Sodom and assume it means that Gildas was calling Malgo a gay man. However, the vine of Sodom, although sharing a root word with sodomite, is actually a reference to Deuteronomy 32:32, a verse from the Pentateuch.
And what's the Pentateuch?
The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, traditionally attributed to Moses.
Oh.
That chapter, Deuteronomy 32, is actually a song, and Moses is singing this song to the Israelites. It says, For their vine is from the vine of Sodom, and from the terraces of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters are bitter. The pulpit commentary has this to say about that verse. How came it that Israel was beaten and put to fight by their enemies? It was because Israel had become wholly corrupt and vitiated. So Gildas's reference to the vine of Sodom is a metaphor, not for queer love, but one that compares a bitter fruit of the Dead Sea region, one beautiful to behold but bitter in taste, to a type of deceit, corruption, and spoiling. This interpretation makes more sense than Gildas calling Malgo a gay man, given the next paragraph of Gildas, which says, After the fantasy of a violent kingdom had yielded to you, was it not you that was filled with desire to return to the right way, repenting of your sins in the divine tenor and the decrees of the monks? Oh, how great the joy of the mother of the church, if you had not been dragged away from her bosom by the enemy. So
Gildas saw that Malgo felt guilt over his family's history of violence, so much so he repented in a manner of a monk.
Right, he may have even taken on the cloth and sequestered himself in a penitentiary.
Put himself in jail?
Penitentiary does mean like prison or jail now, but it has that original meaning, sharing a root word with penitent. Malgo was trying to repent for his family's history of violence, like you pointed out.
But later, Malgo got tired of being a monk, so much to the dismay of the church, he was persuaded by some enemy of the church to be more worldly again.
Right. There were the Celtic Christians in the area, like Gildas, and there are also remaining Celtic pagans in the area.
Okay, so When does he mention Arthur?
Gildas mostly refrains from mentioning anyone specific, and this includes any reference to a specific person named Arthur. But scholars are often really questioning and curious about the potential connections between Gildas's work and the Arthurian legends. Some scholars and historians have that perspective that the Ruin of Britain is more of this rhetorical and moralistic treatise rather than a precise historical record, like we said. But others think that Gildas might be alluding to certain historical figures.
Like maybe someone Arthur-like?
Right, the one that Leslie Alcock describes as the sort of leader who resisted Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain.
So this is the figure that the lords from before appointed to lead them.
Right, and there were lots of these Arthur-like figures. Historical and archaeological evidence points to a specific Arthur-type figure who slowed the westward advance of the Anglo-Saxons at a battle known as Baden Hill in 500 CE, or in Latin, Mons Badonicus, which reminds me of Badonkadonk.
I almost said that. I'm so glad you're the one that said that.
Yes, I said it. Mons Badonicus was where this Arthur-type figure slowed the westward advance of Anglo-Saxons until the next major campaign, when the King of Wessex continued the westward advance in 577 CE, which ended with the permanent separation of Wales from the southwest of Great Britain. Gildas's work laid the foundations for the King Arthur mythos of the 6th century and for the Arthurian legends we have today. Okay, let's get to some more queer stuff. We started at the high-level cultural view, zoomed in to the author, then the text. Now let's apply the queer lens to the text using the basorexia authenticity method. Bam. The first thing that popped out to me, the first basorexic utterance I found in the Richard White selection from Gildas's Ruin of Britain was at the very beginning on page 3. It says Romans. Now, I promise not to talk too much about the Roman Empire, but I thought this was gay because Romans were gay. In the May 2018 episode of Queer as Fact, the hosts delve into the intricate nuances of Roman sexuality, specifically male Roman citizens, and how it challenges modern labels and reveals a cultural framework profoundly different from our contemporary understanding. Although Latin lacks specific terms for homosexuality, heterosexuality, or bisexuality, the Romans did conceptualize their sexuality in a distinctive manner. Imagine a 2x3 grid, first representing the possible orifices for penetration, vagina, anus, and mouth, and the roles of the sexual partners, active and passive. It conceptualizes sex as the act of one person doing something to another. According to Cicero's philosophy, which is indicative of conservative Roman views of the 2nd century CE, allowing oneself to be penetrated represented a submission to the feminine aspect, a departure from the control and self-discipline expected of Roman men. Another term fitting into that 2x3 grid is coitus, often translated as homosexual or passive homosexual. Roman poet Martial's satirical verses use the word coitus, and it captures a bit of this complexity. Laugh heartily at whoever calls you a coitus. You are not a pedico, nor a fututor, nor do you like the warm mouth of Vesutina. I admit it, Sextulus, you are none of these things. So what are you then? I don't know, but you know that there are 2 things left. So, not a coitus, not being the passive partner in anal penetration. Not a pedico, not being the active partner in anal penetration. Not a fututor, the active partner in vaginal penetration. and not wanting to receive oral sex when they talk about the warm mouth of Vestutina. So that just leaves two things, according to this Roman grid of sexuality, giving oral sex to males or females. Another example of how Romans conceptualized sexuality comes from Catullus. It provides an example of how penetrating other men was used to enhance perceived masculinity. In Catullus 16, lines 1 and 2, he issues a rape threat to dispel accusations of effeminacy, exemplifying how penetration became a tool to assert dominance and masculinity. Engaging in sex outside societal norms was frowned upon. Importantly, Roman discussions on sexual preferences did not necessarily highlight a specific preference for one gender over another. Preferences were acknowledged, but not exclusively enforced. However, sexuality among male Roman citizens did have legal implications. Roman law tied certain sexual aspects to an individual's social standing. A man who, quote, submitted to womanly things with his body, end quote, couldn't represent others in court, which was a crucial avenue for political and social advancement. This legal restriction reflected the societal emphasis on self-control in a strict adherence to expected gender roles.
So Roman ideas of sexuality were different, but also not.
Roman sexuality, it requires hermeneutically to fuse our horizons by comparing ancient and contemporary labels so we can appreciate the multifaceted nature of desire and expression in ancient Rome.
So learning that the way Romans perceive sexuality and how that affected them based on being passive or active is really eye-opening, because I know that at least I also thought Romans equals queer and didn't think much past that without any of that sort of background about really getting into the societal levels of it. And we didn't even see anything about sapphic sex in there. They're not in the grid. Sapphics are off the grid.
You said off the grid. That's good. That's great.
I said my little tagline.
Sapphics are off the grid. Actually, that needs to go on a t-shirt or something.
Yeah, I gotta make stickers. It's like, what was the other thing I said I need to make a sticker out? Women in Latin.
Yes.
That's what it was.
Zooming out now, hermeneutically, what is and is not appropriate sexually is almost entirely determined by culture. And the culture of Arthur's Britain was thoroughly infused with the Roman concepts of sexuality. However, the text itself uses Roman as a simple descriptive word and has nothing to do with sexuality.
It's the same as seeing the word Roman and saying it's culinary because Romans drank wine and ate bread.
Right, and that's why this utterance, although it triggered the basorexia, on the queer authenticity scale, it scores a -4, the most inauthentically queer utterance possible. The next basorexia utterance I saw was at the end of page 3 onto page 4. It says, "But the cities of our land are not populated even now as they once were. Right to the present, they are deserted, in ruins, and unkempt." Unkempt stood out to me because it meant something like messy hair. Unkempt has Germanic roots, meaning not combed. It's a synonym of disheveled, which is from Latin roots, meaning messed up hair. Not combing hair is a lack of hygiene. But messed up hair could imply the hair was groomed and then something happened to it. For example, I think the sentence, "Their hair was disheveled after a night of passion," is better than "Their hair was unkempt after a night of passion."
But zooming out, the text specifically uses a word that can be used in reference to a night of passion. Gildas uses the word more as a metaphor, supporting the overall theme of the work, which is polemical in nature.
That's why this utterance scores a -1 on the queer authenticity scale and is slightly inauthentic. Next, on page 4, in our selection from the Ruin of Britain, I had a queer urge when I read that Gildas wrote, "The controls of truth and justice are shaken and overthrown." It was a queer urge because, to me, it meant that Gildas is saying the Britons lost their dom, as if they were in a dom-sub relationship with truth and justice. In antiquity, truth and justice are personified as female, so in this case, Britons would have been into femdom. Among Christian monks, to me, this doesn't seem to be too far from the truth. Enforced chastity is a kink, and it's required of monks. Same with domestic servitude and whipping.
Like that dude in the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, he was kind of the bad guy. He whipped himself, and he had very pale skin. I think anyone who's the enemy of Tom Hanks is my enemy. Zooming out, the text specifically refers to the concept of being controlled by an idea.
Like truth and justice. Wonder Woman.
I am vengeance.
Gildas sets up this control as a positive that has been lost.
Yeah, Gildas wants to be controlled by an idea, and he thinks others should want to be controlled by these ideas as well.
Desiring these ideas is different from desiring to be controlled by these ideas.
Right. Following the tenets of truth and justice, advocating for them or noticing when they're needed are
more neutral?
Yeah, more neutral than how Gildas says that Britons must let themselves be controlled by these ideas. That's why this utterance scores a 2 on the queer authenticity scale and is authentically queer. Basarexic utterance was the heading on page 4. It said, "The complaint, kings." This reminded me of a binary thinking. In psychology, it's called splitting or black and white thinking, which is an immature defense mechanism in which harmful and helpful impulses are split off and segregated. The defending individual segregates experiences into all good and all bad categories, with no room for ambiguity or ambivalence. When splitting is combined with projecting, this 1-2 punch causes the undesirable qualities that one unconsciously perceives oneself as possessing, one unconsciously attributes to the other.
But Gildas was a Briton. He sees the helpful impulses, but splits off the harmful ones and says, this is what's happening in Britain.
Yes.
And because Gildas is in Britain, he's trying to disassociate from that identity and take on an idealized Christian identity and project all harmful impulses onto Britons.
Yeah, Gildas may or may not have been self-aware enough to realize that tyranny and wickedness are common in humans and therefore common in him. It makes me think of the repressed id or the shadow in Jungian psychology, in that Gildas does not assimilate those harmful impulses into himself as being innately human, but rather immaturely and neurotically dissociates from them and projects them onto his fellow countrymen.
Zooming out.
Zooming out? Oh god, that's so stupid.
Computer, zoom out! Okay, so zooming out.
Zooming out.
Text specifically uses binary thinking to make a point that largely reinforces the overall theme of the work. Gildas compares something he thinks is good to something that he thinks is bad, while something he sees as bad is completely natural, and the thing he sees as good requires some labor of being Christian.
Labor? Are you a Marxist?
You wrote this.
Talk about projecting. The projection and splitting, though, are also completely natural in human behavior. And I know of no research showing that it is or isn't especially queer. That's why this utterance scores a 0 on the queer authenticity scale and is neither authentically nor inauthentically queer. The last basarexic utterance, Kelly, was whores and adulteresses.
Oh, specifically the women, huh?
In Latin.
Of course.
It's not surprising coming from a Christian monk to imply that sex work is bad, but according to researcher Alexandra Oliveira, discrimination against sex workers perpetuates rape culture.
Which is normalizing rape due to attitudes about sexuality.
Right. Gildas is working against himself here. Saying the kings marry whores and adulteresses is meant to call out the kings for sin and motivate them to remember how to do what is good in the eyes of God. But discrimination against sex workers increases the chances of sexual violence.
Discriminatory labels are not unfamiliar to queer people. In fact, queer was a slur until it was reappropriated.
And whores and adulteresses are labels that are reappropriated by the BDSM community.
Zooming out.
Yes, from our hermeneutic satellite, we're zooming in and out, in and out, in and out, and now we're reaching the climax.
Oh no. The text uses inflammatory language to support its overall theme, and while the language is misogynistic and exclusionary, the literal definitions of the words may very well be accurate. Some of the kings of 5th and 6th century Britain may very well have taken many wives, some of whom had employment history in sex work, and some of whom had sexual partners other than their spouse.
That's why this utterance scores a 0 on the queer authenticity scale and is neither authentically queer nor inauthentically queer.
Moving forward, this is a section where we'll give you any upcoming announcements.
I have an announcement, Kelly. When I was writing this episode, I used a popular online artificial intelligence, and I put in some information in there, and it flagged that information. But when I changed it just ever so slightly, it didn't flag it. So I would like to encourage our audience members to go to ChatGPT and ask it questions about anal sex. We want to thank all of our friends and family for supporting us in making this podcast.
Special thank you to Andrew Chard for providing us with recording equipment.
And we want to thank all our listeners. This wouldn't be possible without you. Thank you. We acknowledge this podcast was recorded on the traditional land of the Squaxin Island tribe and Nisqually Indian tribe, land sold to the U.S. government under duress in the Treaty of Medicine Creek during the Puget Sound War of 1855 to 1856.
If you want to join our community, you can find us on all social media. Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube are all under Queering Arthur, and the Instagram is under Queering Arthur Pod.
You can also send us an email at queeringarthurpodcast@gmail.com. And like good millennials, we have a Patreon, and you can join the $1 tier and be part of the Queering Arthur retinue. You can be one of the retainers. Retainers get a shout-out, early access to exclusive merch, and access to the community Discord server, where we will continue the conversation. I'm excited to soon announce a special project that will take place via the Discord server, so stay tuned. In any case, make sure to check out the discussion items in the show notes. But now that you know a little bit about our authentically queer interpretation of how a 6th century British monk decried the loss of the controls of truth and justice, let me leave you with this. Do you think that letting yourself be controlled by an idea is a form of submission? Stay chivalrous, queerthers.